Chapter 8 Last Words. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 to 13. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life. But teach them thy sons, and thy sons' sons, especially the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, Gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. And ye came near and stood under the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire unto the midst of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick darkness. And the Lord spake unto you out of the midst of the fire. Ye heard the voice of the words, but saw no similitude, only ye heard a voice. And he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 to 13. Scholars in this century have very ably demonstrated the covenantal character of the Bible, and in particular of the law. The legal form and structure of covenants is carefully followed. We can contend that the covenantal form was adopted by the nations of antiquity from God's covenants with men, but in any case, it is clear that we have in Deuteronomy, for example, the legal form of a covenant. This, however, should not lead us to limit Deuteronomy to a covenant form. It is also a series of statements by a man facing death. We are familiar with the idea of a dying man's last words, but we are not familiar with the actuality. A man's last words were common facts over the centuries and into my lifetime. They do not necessarily refer to statements made as a man lay dying. They were often made early in illness, in anticipation of death, and to as many children, grandchildren, and kinsfolk as possible. The family came from near and far. The dying man's words were a blessing, a warning, a passing on of the wisdom of years of living, and also a bequest. The bequest aspect disappeared as status power grew and paper authority ousted other forms of willing properties. The warning aspect is perhaps the least remembered, although we see it in Genesis chapter 48, verse 1 to chapter 49, verse 33, as in Jacob's last words. The warning aspects of a man's last words called attention to a person's weaknesses and sins. In our thinking, we all usually stress the positive aspects of our nature and of our genetic inheritance. We overlook our sins and shortcomings, that is, our laziness, our bad temper, our selfishness, and so on and on. This leads to the chosen people mentality. That is, I am God's chosen because I am superior, not because of his amazing sovereign grace. Both Israel and the church are prone to this. Again, in our thinking, we either excuse or separate ourselves from those in our near family or ancestry who remind us of the bad seed in our line of descent. What Moses does in his last words, a rite that has been common in Christian history, is to remind Israel of their aptitude for sin and rebellion. Israel stupidly and immorally assumed its virtue, but Moses says, "This is your wisdom and understanding to keep and do what God's law commands." Verse 6. Towards the end of blessing Israel, Moses teaches Israel, "Statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me." Verse 5. The bequests made by a dying man were not limited to property. A moral bequest could be made. Such bequests often had a preface, most commonly, "My son." This tells us a great deal at once about a man's last words. They had, as a central object of address, the son who was the main heir. The book of Proverbs again and again speaks to "my son." Proverbs chapter 1 verse 8, verse 10 and verse 15, chapter 2 verse 1, etc. It is not only a commentary on the law, but a moral bequest of the law and wisdom to an heir. The warning and the moral bequest were closely linked. The person making the bequest would warn the person, saying, "This is what you are," and then, "This is what you should be." A man's dying or last words were thus a final reminder of a person's besetting sin or sins, and at the same time, a reminder that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. It should be apparent now that a man's last words were in part a repetition of warnings made over a lifetime, which now, in the presence of death, are given a moral urgency. The moral urgency of Moses' last words is heightened by the fact that Moses can remind them that he has the authority of God and his covenant behind his every word. Israel had seen God's amazing revelations of himself, so they were without excuse, verses 8 to 13. Moses therefore says, "Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life." Verse 9. They were a privileged people because God had given them his law, according to verses 10 to 13. The same applies to the church. Its privilege is God's law, and to abandon God's law is to abandon God and his covenant. In the words of Lewis Goldberg, Moses announces that he will teach the decrees and laws to the second generation, chapter 4, verse 1. The request to follow the law did not ask for blind obedience to it, but rather the people needed to be willing to understand the word and know what they were to do. These decrees and laws were the very life of the people as they sought to take the land which the God of their fathers was about to give them. According to verse 9, the law was to be taught to the sons and their sons' sons. This was Moses' key bequest, the God-given law. The life of the people and of the nation depended on this knowledge and obedience. For this reason, at every celebration of the Passover, the youngest male child capable of understanding asked the question about the meaning of the rite. Exodus chapter 12, verses 26 and 27. The significance of their moral inheritance had to be kept alive. The stress on the moral bequest became a part of a man's last words into our time. Some generations ago, an eloquent moral and religious bequest was made by the dying Patrick Henry. Throughout Deuteronomy, Moses makes a simple correlation. Obedience to God's covenant law means life and blessings, whereas disobedience means curses and death. This is set forth powerfully in Deuteronomy chapter 28 in particular. Obedience means survival and prosperity. In verses 7 and 8, Moses stresses two things. First, God has established a close relationship with Israel by giving them his law. This is an act of grace with no merit on Israel's part. No other nation had been so favoured. Second, Israel's pride should be in God's law, not in themselves. Their advantage over the nations was not in themselves, but in the fact of God's law, of which, by grace, they were custodians. While many faults can be found with the nations of great antiquity, one fact is clear: their high regard for law, as Mays pointed out. The idea that the collection and promulgation of law is a proof of wisdom is, however, ancient, and is to be found in the prologues and epilogues of ancient Near Eastern law codes. Compare, for example, the Code of Hammurabi. Moses tells Israel in verses 6 to 8 that their greatness would lie in the fact of their possession of and obedience to the law of the living God, not in themselves. Apart from God's grace, they were nothing. If they obey God, the nations will find themselves compelled to say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." Verse 6. Several times Moses promises them that other nations will envy them if they are faithful. For what nation is there so great who hath God so nigh unto them as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as thou hast heard, and live? Or hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 33 and 34. The grace of God gave Israel grounds for joy, not pride, but they took no joy in the Lord, but pride in their status. They thus turned a blessing into a curse. Once we recognize the facts of last words, we encounter it repeatedly in the Bible, and we understand Scripture better. Supremely, of course, the great example of last words is our Lord's words at the Last Supper. Here also the greater prophet or Moses speaks of the law, saying, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." John chapter 14, verse 15. Compare chapter 15, verse 14.